Elizabeth Whitmore set down her husband's untouched coffee cup, straightened her spine, and walked out of the breakfast room without a single word because after 3 years of saying good morning to a man who never looked up from his ledgers, she had simply run out of words to say. If you've ever loved someone who looked right through you, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Stay until the very last word and drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. She had been invisible for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Elizabeth Whitmore. Ashford knew the number because she had counted. Not deliberately, not with any great dramatic intention, but the way a woman counts the spaces between heartbeats when the man sleeping beside her has stopped asking how she feels. She had started counting the morning after their first wedding anniversary, when Nathaniel had risen before dawn, dressed in silence, and left the house without once turning to look at her still form beneath the coverlet. She had lain there, eyes open to the white plaster ceiling of Ashford Manor's master bedchamber, listening to the sound of his horse's hooves disappearing down the gravel drive, and thought he forgot. Not the anniversary. Men of Nathaniel's breed did not forget dates. He had in fact left a pearl necklace on her dressing table, a fine thing, cold and correct, chosen no doubt by his housekeeper, Mrs. Delacroix, who understood that certain obligations must be maintained in a household of standing. He had not forgotten the anniversary. He had simply forgotten her. There was a difference. Elizabeth understood that difference the way she understood the particular quality of silence in a room. After a door has been closed firmly from the other side, she had not cried that morning. She had not cried the morning after either, nor the morning after that. Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford was not a woman given to easy tears. Her mother, a sharp-tongued and honest Virginia woman named Frances Whitmore, had raised her with a spine and a set of clear eyes, and had told her once, only once, but with great conviction, that a woman who cried at every slight would spend her whole life with swollen eyelids and accomplish nothing of worth. Elizabeth had taken that to heart. What she had done instead of crying was learn to be useful. She managed the household accounts with a precision that made Mr. Delacroix, the estate steward, uncomfortable because he had grown accustomed to a mistress who asked no questions. She organized the charitable giving that Nathaniel's name was attached to because someone had to read the letters from the Methodist school in the Valley and the Widows' Aid Society in Charlottesville, and Nathaniel certainly wasn't going to do it. She learned the names of every field worker, their wives, their children. She kept a small leather journal, the kind with a brass clasp, in which she recorded what seeds had been planted, where which fences needed mending, which of the tenant families were struggling through a bad season. She was by every measure the finest thing that had ever happened to Ashford Manor. Nathaniel Ashford did not know this. Or if he knew it, he had no language for it. He was 34 years old, the heir to the largest private landholding in central Virginia, and he had been taught from boyhood that management was a matter of authority and ledgers and firm handshakes. Feelings his own or anyone else's were not part of the curriculum. His father had been a cold man. His grandfather had been a colder one. Nathaniel had simply accepted this as the natural temperature of the Ashford blood. He had married Elizabeth Whitmore because she was suitable, because her family name was old and respected, because she was quiet, which he had mistaken for contentment, because she was lovely dark-haired and gray-eyed and possessed of a quality of stillness that he had found at 24, something close to restful. He had not asked himself whether he loved her. He had asked himself whether she would make a good mistress of his estate. She had, by every observable measure, exceeded expectations. He simply never told her so. The summer of 1816 arrived in Virginia with a particular cruelty. The spring had been strange cold when it should have been warming the fruit trees blossoming late and then getting hit by a frost that turned the blossoms black, and the farmers all through the Piedmont were talking in low, worried voices about what was happening to the seasons. But by July, the heat had settled in with its usual ferocity, and Ashford Manor was hung with linen and open windows, and the afternoon air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass, and the river that ran along the eastern edge of the property. It was the height of the social season. In Virginia's planter society, summer meant an endless circuit of balls, suppers, horse races, and garden parties. occasions at which the families who mattered gathered to see and be seen, to conduct the business that they could not conduct in ledgers, to arrange the marriages and alliances, and quiet financial conversations that kept the whole elaborate structure of their world functioning. Nathaniel Ashford was one of the most sought-after presences at any of these events. Men wanted his opinion on land prices and political matters. Women, the unattached ones, and if they were honest, some of the attached ones wanted his attention for reasons that had nothing to do with land prices. He attended these gatherings as he attended everything efficiently, deliberately, and without apparent enjoyment. Elizabeth attended them as she attended everything in her life, with Nathaniel beside him, in the carriage beside him on arrival, and then quietly, almost immediately alone. It was not that he was unkind to her at these events. He was not a cruel man. He did not humiliate her, or speak over her, or openly ignore her in a way that people could easily identify and whisper about. He was simply absent. He greeted her when they arrived. He seated her when there was a supper table. He acknowledged her when introduced to someone new. But then he moved away toward the men, toward the conversations that interested him, and Elizabeth was left to manage herself, which she was perfectly capable of doing, which was precisely the problem. She was too capable of managing herself. She had learned to be. She had learned to make conversation with the wives of his associates, to admire their children, to remember which one had been ill last winter, and ask after their recovery with genuine warmth. She had learned to stand at a ball with her back straight and her expression pleasantly composed, and not let the loneliness show, because the moment a woman of her position let the loneliness show, she became an object of either pity or gossip. And Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford would be neither. But she felt it. Every evening, every gathering, every time she watched her husband laugh at something another man said, and thought, I have never once made him laugh like that. She stopped trying to remember when she had last tried. The Hartwell Summer Ball was the grandest event of the season, held at the Hartwell Plantation on the second Saturday of July. The Hartwells were not quite as old a family as the Ashfords, and not quite as wealthy, but they understood spectacle in a way that old Virginia money sometimes didn't, and their balls were known for being genuinely magnificent. The kind of evening where the chandeliers blazed until 2 in the morning, and the punch bowl was never allowed to empty, and the musicians, hired all the way from Richmond, played with a skill that made even people who did not enjoy dancing feel the pull of the floor. Elizabeth wore a gown of pale cream silk with a deep blue sash. She had chosen it herself, which was the only area of her life where Nathaniel consistently deferred to her judgment. He would say, "Wear what you like," and she would, and he would look at her when she descended the stairs with what she had once early in their marriage mistaken for admiration. She had since come to understand it as assessment. She passed. She always passed. The Ashford name required that she pass. The carriage ride to the Hartwells was 20 minutes. They spent it in silence that was not companionable. It was simply silence. Nathaniel looked out one window. Elizabeth looked out the other. At some point he said, "The Loring brothers will be there tonight. I need a word with them about the millwrights on Buckhorn Creek." She said, "Of course." He said nothing else. She thought about the letter she had written that morning to the Methodist school in the valley, recommending a donation from the Ashford Charitable Fund for their new schoolroom. She had not mentioned it to Nathaniel. She rarely mentioned things to Nathaniel anymore, because his responses were always courteous and always vague. "Yes, that sounds fine, Elizabeth," or "Do as you think best," which had the exact effect of making her feel that she was speaking into an empty room. The Hartwell house was blazing with light when they arrived. Nathaniel handed her down from the carriage with the practiced courtesy that was second nature to a man of his upbringing. His hand steady, his expression composed, and then offered her his arm for the walk to the entrance, which she took, and which she released the moment they stepped through the doors into the warmth and music and press of 300 of Virginia's finest. He was gone within 4 minutes. She counted those 2. Chopside. She found a position near the east windows, which was where she usually positioned herself. The east windows overlooked the Hartwells' kitchen garden, which was not the most glamorous view, but had the advantage of being somewhat removed from the loudest concentrations of people. And Elizabeth had long since discovered that a woman standing near windows at a ball was assumed to be appreciating the view rather than standing alone, which meant she attracted fewer questions about whether she was quite all right. She was quite all right. That was the maddening thing. She was not devastated. She was not crumbling. She was simply lonely. Profoundly, quietly, persistently lonely, in the way that only a woman who has everything society says she should want can be lonely when the one thing society never mentions, the thing of being truly known by another person, has been absent so long she has almost forgotten what it felt like to hope for it. She watched the room. She had become very good at watching rooms. She could tell you within 10 minutes of arriving at any gathering who was worried about money, who was in love with someone they shouldn't be, who was performing happiness, and who was genuinely experiencing it. She had a quality that she had never found a name for, a kind of quiet attentiveness that made people feel when they talked to her that she was actually listening, which she was. It was, she thought sometimes, her only truly remarkable quality. Nathaniel had never noticed it because Nathaniel rarely talked to her about anything that required real listening. She watched her husband across the room. He was talking to the Loring brothers, two large red-faced men who controlled the millwrights on half the waterways in the county. Nathaniel was leaning slightly forward in that way he had when he was making a point he considered important, one hand moving in a small, decisive gesture. He was, Elizabeth thought, with the particular honesty she permitted herself only in private, a genuinely handsome man, tall, dark-haired, with a quality of contained strength that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without his having to try. She had been 21 when her father had brought her the match, and she had been, she could admit, it rather struck by him. She had actually thought that the quietness was depth, that the seriousness was feeling that ran too strong for easy expression, that she would find in time the way through to him. 3 years had been long enough to understand that she had been wrong. Not about the depth. She still believed in some stubborn, persistent corner of herself that there was something real beneath the frost of him. But she had been wrong about finding the way through. She had tried every door she could find, and all of them had been locked, and after a long while, she had stopped knocking. Not because she had given up exactly, but because a woman has a limited quantity of herself to offer, and Elizabeth had become very careful about how much of hers she spent on a man who never looked up when she walked into a room. Mrs. Ashford. She turned. The man standing at her elbow was perhaps 31 younger than Nathaniel, with an open, pleasant face, and the kind of easy confidence that came not from wealth exactly, though he was clearly a man of means, but from genuinely liking people. He was dressed well in the dark coat and cravat of a gentleman, and he had brown eyes that were at this moment looking directly at her. Looking at her. Not past her, not at the room beyond her, at her. "Forgive me," he said, and he sounded genuinely as if he wanted to be forgiven, not as if forgiveness was a social formality. "I don't believe we've been introduced. William Carter. I've recently arrived from Boston. I'm here visiting the Hartwells on some legal business, and I confess I've been standing here for the past 10 minutes trying to work up the courage to introduce myself because you looked—" He paused, seemed to consider whether to continue. Continued. "You looked like the most interesting person in the room, and I've never been good at ignoring interesting people." Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. "Elizabeth Ashford," she said. "And I should warn you, Mr. Carter, that I'm almost certainly not as interesting as I look from across a room." "I'd like to form my own opinion on that, if you'll permit me," he said. And he smiled, not the practiced smile of a man performing charm, but the genuine, slightly crooked smile of a man who found the world entertaining and was glad she was in it. She had forgotten she realized what it felt like to have someone glad she was in it. "You may try," she said. He did not ask to dance with her, not immediately. He simply began to talk. He asked her about the county, about the families she knew, about the estate she managed, because within 3 minutes of conversation, it was clear to him that she was managing something considerable, and he said so directly, without any of the careful softening that Virginia gentlemen usually applied when a topic approached a woman's actual capabilities. He talked about Boston, about the law practice he was building there, about the case that had brought him to Virginia, a land dispute. He said, though he could not discuss the particulars, confidentiality being what it was. He had a quality of listening that Elizabeth recognized because she had it herself, and it was startling to be on the receiving end of it. Across the room, Nathaniel Ashford finished his conversation with the Loring brothers, turned to locate his wife by habit, the same way a man checks that his watch is in his pocket, not because he wants to look at it, but because it should be where it is, and found her near the east windows, talking to a man he did not recognize. He watched for a moment. He was not a jealous man. He had never had occasion to be jealous. Elizabeth was a faithful woman. He did not doubt this for a moment, not because he credited her with extraordinary virtue, but because he had never seen her give any man the slightest encouragement. She was pleasant to everyone and warm to no one, which had always seemed right to him, which was correct behavior for a woman of her position. But she was laughing. It was a small sound, he was too far away to hear it, but he could see it in the change of her face, and it stopped him. Because he realized, standing across a crowded ballroom with fiddles playing and men talking around him, that he could not remember the last time he had seen her laugh. Not smile, she smiled often enough. The composed, correct smile she wore at public occasions. But laugh. The real kind that reached her eyes and changed the whole shape of her face. He watched the man say something. He watched Elizabeth look down for a moment and then back up. And there it was again, that laugh. And the man was leaning slightly toward her with the expression of someone who had said something clever and been rewarded for it. And Nathaniel felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He turned back to the room. There was someone he needed to talk to about the tobacco warehouse lease. He went to find that person. William Carter asked Elizabeth to dance precisely once that evening. The dance was a country reel, energetic, not intimate, the kind of dance where partners are constantly changing, and the room becomes a general happy chaos of movement. Elizabeth danced it with the pleasure of someone who genuinely liked dancing and rarely had the chance. When it was over, William bowed to her with a formality that was just enough to be correct and just little enough to be warm, and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. You're a fine dancer." "My mother insisted," she said. She believed that a woman who danced well would always know what to do with her feet, and a woman who knows what to do with her feet can manage almost anything. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was the most remarkable woman I ever knew," Elizabeth said. And then quietly, "She died 3 years ago, the spring after my wedding." Something shifted in William Carter's expression. Not pity, she would have closed the conversation immediately at pity, but a real human acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," he said. "Truly." "Thank you," she said. "Truly." They stood for a moment in the comfortable aftermath of the reel, catching their breath. Then William said, "I'll be in the county for several weeks. The Hartwells have kindly offered their hospitality while the legal matter is resolved. I hope, if it wouldn't be improper, that we might talk again. I find that I'm unlikely to meet anyone else who can speak with equal authority on tenant farming charitable foundations and the particular character of Virginia Rain." She laughed again, that real laugh. "I don't believe it's improper to say good afternoon to a man at someone else's dinner party, Mr. Carter." "Good," he said. "Then I look forward to many good afternoons." She thought, walking away, that she had not had a real conversation, a conversation where someone asked her questions and meant them, where she had felt the actual pleasure of being heard, in longer than she could clearly remember. She did not let herself think that too long. It led to a place she did not want to be tonight. She found Nathaniel near the supper room at 10:30. He was by then ready to leave. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular contained impatience of a man who has completed the business that brought him somewhere and sees no further reason to remain. He offered her his arm without looking at her directly. She took it. "Did you get what you needed from the Loring brothers?" she asked. "The mill rights will be settled by August," he said. "We'll have control of the Buckhorn Creek access." "Good," she said. They walked to the carriage. He handed her in. The door closed. The night was warm and full of insects and the smell of Virginia summer, and through the carriage window, the Hartwell house blazed behind them like something on fire. Nathaniel said, "Who was that man you were dancing with?" The question was so unexpected that Elizabeth took a moment to answer. Not because she was startled, she was rarely startled, but because she had to decide in that small space of silence exactly how to respond. "William Carter," she said. "A lawyer from Boston. He's visiting the Hartwells on a legal matter." "Carter." Nathaniel turned the name over. "I don't know the family." "Boston family, I believe. He seemed a pleasant man." Silence. Then Nathaniel said, "You were laughing." She looked at him. In the dim interior of the carriage, his face was difficult to read. It was always difficult to read, but there was something in the quality of his stillness that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the stillness of a man who is thinking about something else. This was the stillness of a man who was thinking about her. She said simply. He did not say anything else. The carriage moved through the dark Virginia night, and the fireflies were out in the fields they passed, and Elizabeth looked out her window and thought about what it had felt like to be looked at, really looked at, not assessed, not acknowledged. Looked at the way you look at something that matters to you. She had almost forgotten it could feel like that. She did not sleep easily that night. She lay in her room. They had had separate rooms since the first year, which was not unusual in households of their class, but which she had never quite made peace with, and listened to the house settle around her, the old timbers shifting in the heat, and thought about the conversation she'd had. She took it apart carefully, the way she took apart everything, looking for the places where she had said too much or too little, where she had been foolish or had embarrassed herself. She found none. William Carter had been entirely proper. She had been entirely proper. There was nothing to reproach herself for. And yet she felt awake. More awake than she had felt in a long time. As if something in her that had gone very quiet had been reminded of the sound it used to make. That frightened her a little. She recognized the danger in that feeling, and she was honest enough with herself to name it. She was a married woman, and the marriage was not going to change, and feeling awake was not the same as being free to act on it. She was not her mother's daughter for nothing. She had her spine. She had her eyes clear, but lying in the dark in the house that had her name on its household accounts and her handwriting in its charitable ledgers, and none of her love anywhere she could see it. She let herself feel it, that small, stubborn pulse of aliveness, and she did not tell herself to stop. She let it be there. And then she thought with a clarity that surprised her in its suddenness, "This is not enough. This has not been enough for a long time. And I have been so careful to be sufficient to myself that I have not let myself notice what it costs." She did not cry, but she lay there a long time looking at the ceiling while the Virginia summer breathed outside her window, and she let herself finally, quietly, without drama, understand the truth of her situation. She had been invisible. She had been invisible, and she had managed it so well that even she had started to believe she didn't mind. She minded. She was at breakfast when Nathaniel came down the next morning, which was not unusual. She was always at breakfast because she managed the household, and the household started with the morning. What was unusual was that he stopped before going to his chair at the far end of the table. The table was very long, which was another thing she had never quite made peace with, that table, and the distance it created, and looked at her. Not past her. At her. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked up. "Good morning, Nathaniel." He stood there for a moment in a way that was unusual for him. Nathaniel did not stand in doorways. He moved through them. He was not a hesitating man, and yet here he was at the entrance to the breakfast room with something that might in another man have been called uncertainty in his expression. "Did you enjoy last evening?" he asked. She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him with the clear gray eyes that her mother had given her and said, "I did, quite genuinely. Did you?" "I accomplished what I went for," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." A pause. He moved to his chair. Mrs. Delacroix appeared with his coffee. He accepted it and she withdrew, and for a moment the breakfast room was very quiet, except for the sounds of a Virginia summer morning through the windows. "Carter," he said. "The lawyer. He'll be in the county some weeks, you said." "Several weeks, I believe. The Hartwells are hosting him." Nathaniel looked at his coffee. "I see." She waited. This was unusual too, the waiting on his part. He was not a man who waited for his own thoughts to arrive. He usually knew what he was going to say before he opened his mouth. "I don't believe," he said carefully, "that I have asked you in some time whether you are content here." The word content landed between them with a small, painful weight. She thought about all the true answers she could give him. She had a list of them, honest and articulate and long, that she had composed in her head over many quiet mornings at this very table. She thought about the pearl necklace on her dressing table. She thought about the sounds of his horse on the gravel. She thought about the laugh that had surprised out of her last night, the real one, the one she had not managed in longer than she could say, and how something as simple as being asked a genuine question had produced it. "I am very capable of managing here," she said, which was true, and was the kindest version of the truth she had available. He heard the distinction. She saw it in the small change in his expression. He heard it, and he did not immediately know what to do with it, and the not knowing was the most human thing she had seen from him in 3 years, and she sat with it, and did not help him, because she had been helping him for 3 years, and it had not helped either of them. "I should go over the morning accounts," he said. "Of course," she said. He rose. He walked to the door. He stopped with his back to her and said so quietly that she wasn't entirely sure she'd heard it correctly, "You looked well last night, in the cream gown." And then he was gone. Elizabeth sat at the long breakfast table with her coffee cooling in front of her. Outside the windows, the Virginia morning was heating up the way it did in July, that heavy, golden, relentless heat that pressed down on everything and made even the birds go quiet by noon. She sat very still. "You looked well last night. 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. And those 4 words, unprompted, unasked for, offered of his own accord in a low voice in a morning doorway, were the closest he had come to seeing her. She did not cry, but she pressed her hand flat on the table and felt the cool surface of it under her palm and breathed. And thought something has changed. I don't know what. I don't know if it matters, but something has changed. And she thought about William Carter's genuine eyes and her own sudden laugh and the feeling of being awake, and she thought carefully, honestly, with her mother's clear-eyed practicality, "I will not make this into something it isn't. But I will not go back to being invisible either. I have done enough of that." Outside, the heat settled in. The horses moved in the paddock. The day began. Elizabeth Ashford picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down, and went to find Mrs. Delacroix and the household accounts, because the estate did not manage itself and never had, and she had never been a woman who waited for things to come to her when she could walk toward them instead. She walked out of that breakfast room with her spine straight and her eyes clear, her mother's daughter to the bone, and the question she was carrying. What am I willing to keep giving to a life that does not give back? Moved with her, quiet and persistent, and no longer something she was trying not to think about. She was thinking about it now, and that Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford understood was the beginning of something. She did not yet know what. She only knew that the long-practiced silence she had wrapped around herself like armor was no longer entirely comfortable, and that discomfort that crack in the careful management of herself was either going to hurt her very much or change everything. She was not yet sure which she was hoping for. The morning after Nathaniel's 4 quiet words in the doorway, Elizabeth did something she had not done in 3 years. She went riding alone. Not the careful supervised rides she occasionally took when Nathaniel suggested the exercise would do her good. Suggestions offered the way a man suggests a tonic for a mild complaint without real attention to whether the patient wanted the medicine. She saddled her own horse, told the stable boy she didn't need a groom, and rode out before the house was fully awake into the gold and green of a Virginia summer morning that smelled like wet grass and coming heat. She rode hard. Harder than was strictly proper for a woman of her position. She let the mare have her head on the long stretch along the river field and felt the speed of it. The physical, uncomplicated fact of moving fast through open air and something in her chest that had been very tightly wound began infinitesimally to loosen. She did not think about William Carter. She was careful not to. She thought instead about herself, about the woman she had been before she became Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford, the woman her mother had raised, the woman who had opinions and plans and a very specific idea of what her life was supposed to feel like. She tried to locate that woman the way you try to locate a sound you heard a moment ago and aren't sure was real. She was still there, quieter than she used to be, more careful, but there. Elizabeth pulled the mare to a walk at the far end of the river field and sat for a long moment, looking at the water moving over the stones. Then she turned the horse back toward the house and rode home at a measured pace, thinking. She had decisions to make, not the dramatic, irreversible kind. She was not a dramatic woman, and she had no appetite for irreversible decisions made in the heat of a sleepless night. But the smaller, quieter kind. The decisions about how to spend what remained of herself. Whether to keep pouring energy into a household that ran beautifully, and a marriage that ran on silence, or whether to begin carefully honestly, without cruelty to anyone, directing some of that energy toward her own life. Her mother had told her once, the worst thing a woman can do is make herself so small she disappears. Because once you've disappeared, no one can find you, not even yourself. Elizabeth had been 20 years old when she heard that. She had not understood it fully then. She understood it now. The summer social calendar did not pause for private reckonings. 2 days after the Hartwell ball, there was a dinner at the Moorfield estate, a smaller affair. 30 guests, the kind of Virginia gathering where the real conversations happened because the room was intimate enough for them. Nathaniel attended as he attended everything, and Elizabeth attended beside him, and they arrived, and she released his arm, and he moved toward the men, and she began the familiar, careful navigation of being Mrs. Ashford in a room full of people. William Carter was there. She had not expected that the Moorfields were not the Hartwells, and she had not known the connection, and when she saw him across the sitting room talking to old Colonel Moorfield with every sign of genuine interest in whatever the colonel was saying, she felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure, and was definitely, she noted with precision, something. He saw her approximately 3 minutes later. His expression did not do anything theatrical. He did not stop mid-sentence or make any visible change in his behavior, but he caught her eye and offered a small, genuine nod of acknowledgement. The kind that said, "I see you," without saying anything at all, and then returned his full attention to Colonel Moorfield. She found herself approving of that, more than she expected to. They did not speak until supper, where the arrangement of the table placed her near enough to him for conversation, without being near enough to suggest anything. He greeted her with propriety, and asked with what she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic directness, whether she had been out much since the Hartwell ball. "I went riding yesterday morning," she said. "Alone. Alone." He considered this. "Good," he said simply. She looked at him. "Most men of my acquaintance would have expressed concern about a woman riding alone." "Most men of your acquaintance," he said pleasantly, "have probably never met a woman quite like you, Mrs. Ashford." And then, before she could decide what to do with that, "I spoke with your husband briefly before supper." She kept her expression level. "Did you?" He asked about my legal work in the county. "We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes." He paused. "He's a more careful listener than he appears." "He listens to things that matter to him," Elizabeth said, and heard the quiet precision of her own words, and left them there. William looked at her for a moment. "That's an honest thing to say. I'm generally an honest woman, Mr. Carter." "I know," he said. "That was the first thing I understood about you." Across the table, she was aware without looking that Nathaniel had glanced in their direction. She did not look at him. She reached for her water glass and took a composed sip and asked William about the legal case that had brought him to Virginia, knowing he couldn't discuss it simply to give the conversation somewhere to go. That wasn't the direction it was very efficiently heading. After supper, the party moved to the Moorfields' large sitting room for music and cards. Elizabeth played the pianoforte when asked. She played well, always had one of the genuine pleasures of her inner life, and the room appreciated it in the way Virginia rooms appreciated things warmly, with compliments that were both sincere and performed at the same time. Nathaniel, standing near the doorway, listened. She knew he was listening. She didn't let herself look at him while she played, but she knew. When she finished and stood to give up the bench to the next player, William Carter was there to offer his hand as she rose, which was entirely proper and entirely unnecessary, and she took it for the 2 seconds it lasted, and was aware in those 2 seconds of how long it had been since anyone had offered her casual, instinctive physical courtesy, the kind that didn't feel like duty. She stepped away from the piano and nearly walked into Nathaniel. He was closer than she expected. He had moved from the doorway at some point during the playing, moved toward her, which was not something he typically did in social settings, and now he was there in front of her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You played beautifully," he said. She looked at him. Something passed through his expression, something quick and undefended gone before she could name it. "Thank you," she said. "I'd forgotten," he said, "that you play like that." The words landed somewhere soft in her, and she didn't allow herself to show it. "I practice most mornings," she said, "when the household permits." He nodded. He looked as if he wanted to say something else and could not locate it. That was new. She had never seen him struggle for words. He was precise and economical, and always said exactly what he meant to say, and nothing more. This uncertainty was new. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, not unkindly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. And that came out almost sharp, but not sharp in his usual way where the sharpness was just the edge of efficiency. It was sharp in a way that sounded like someone who had caught themselves off balance and didn't like the feeling. "I know that," he said again, quieter. "I'm choosing to." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "All right," and meant it as exactly what it was. Not a concession and not a warmth, but a door. She was leaving technically unlocked because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had told her to be honest, but never to be cruel. She moved into the room. He did not follow her, which she expected, but she felt his gaze on her back for a long time afterward, and it felt different from being watched by a man who is checking that his property is where he left it. It felt like being watched by a man who has just realized he might lose something and does not yet know what to do about that. She let herself feel what she felt about that, which was complicated, and she did not try to simplify it. 3 days later, Elizabeth received a note. It came through entirely proper channels, delivered to the house by a Hartwell servant, addressed to Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford in a clear, upright hand, and it said simply that Mr. William Carter, finding himself with an unexpected free afternoon, wondered whether Mrs. Ashford might be willing to receive a visitor if it was convenient and proper to do so, and he would understand completely if she preferred he did not call. She read it twice. Then she sat for a moment with it in her hands. The correct thing, the safe thing, was to decline. Not because there was anything improper in a visitor calling at a household. Visitors called at households all the time. But because she was aware of herself the way she had always been aware of herself. And she knew that the thing she had felt across a supper table, and in the 2 seconds of a hand offered and taken, was a thing that required careful handling. And careful handling sometimes meant not putting yourself in the position to need to handle it. But she thought about riding alone along the river. She thought about her mother. She thought about the word content and what it cost to say it as an evasion when the true answer was longer and harder and had been waiting in her throat for 3 years. She wrote back, "Mr. Carter, you are welcome to call Thursday afternoon at 3. Elizabeth Ashford." She did not tell Nathaniel that she'd extended the invitation. This was not deceit visitors called, and she was the mistress of the household, and she did not require his permission to receive them. But she was aware of the deliberateness of not mentioning it, and she was honest enough with herself to name what that deliberateness was. She was doing one small contained thing that was entirely her own, and she was not going to make it smaller by asking anyone's approval for it. Jate. William Carter arrived Thursday at 3 with a book. This detail struck her as so characteristic of the man she was beginning to understand him to be, that she nearly laughed when Mrs. Delacroix announced him, and he stepped into the sitting room with a slim volume in his hand, looking entirely at ease in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with simply being comfortable inside his own skin. "I hope you'll forgive me," he said. "I was talking with Mrs. Hartwell last night about literature. She mentioned you were a reader, and I have been carrying this around for 3 days, intending to lend it to someone who might appreciate it." He held it out. It was a collection of essays philosophical she saw from the Spine recent. "You don't have to read it," he added. "I just thought you might want to." She took it. She turned it over. "Mrs. Hartwell told you I was a reader. She told me you were the finest mind in the county, and it was a waste that no one seemed to know it," he said pleasantly. I paraphrased. Elizabeth set the book on the side table and sat down and gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Mr. Carter, before you say something that gets you thrown out of Virginia entirely." He sat, and he smiled, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. About the essays which she had not yet read, but which he described in a way that made her want to immediately. About the law, and what it was supposed to do for people, and what it actually did, which were sometimes the same thing, and often were not. About Virginia and Boston, and the ways the two places understood the world differently. He told her about his family, a father who had been a teacher, a mother who had run the household and 3 younger siblings, and a small lending library out of their front parlor simultaneously. She told him about Frances Whitmore, and how her mother had always said that a woman with a good mind was twice blessed and half appreciated, and that the trick was to go on using the mind regardless. "She sounds remarkable," he said for the second time. "She was," Elizabeth said, "and this time it didn't hurt the way it sometimes did. She would have liked you, I think. She liked people who looked directly at things." "I like people who look directly at things," he said. "I know," she said. "That's actually why I wrote back." There was a small pause. He did not do anything with that pause except acknowledge it, one small direct nod. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I want to be honest with you about something." "Please be," she said. "I'm aware of the position I'm in coming here. I'm aware of what it could look like, and I want you to know that I have no interest in creating any difficulty for you. I asked to call because I find your company genuinely valuable, and I thought you might. I thought you might not have enough of that. Company that treats you as valuable." He paused. "I'm not wrong about that, am I?" It was not quite a question. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "No, you're not wrong." "Then I'm glad I came," he said simply, "and I'll conduct myself accordingly." She believed him. She believed him because he was the kind of man you believed, not because he was perfect, but because everything about him was consistent, and consistency was a thing she had learned to trust above almost everything else. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without any performance. What happened next happened slowly, which was the only way real things in Elizabeth Ashford's life ever happened. She was not a woman for sudden leaps. She moved carefully, and she built carefully, and she tested the ground before she committed her weight to it. So what happened over the following 2 weeks happened in the way a river carves a canyon. Not with dramatic violence, but with the persistent patient force of water, finding the path of least resistance. William called twice more, both times, properly announced both times in the afternoon when callers came. He was unfailingly correct in every externally visible way. He brought her another book, this one a novel which he pretended to be slightly embarrassed about, which she did not believe for a moment, and he engaged Mrs. Delacroix in conversation about the household with such genuine interest that the housekeeper, who was not a woman easily charmed, told Elizabeth afterward that she thought him a very sensible young man, which from Mrs. Delacroix was nearly a declaration of love. But the things that mattered were smaller than the visits. They were in the way Elizabeth began to move through her days. She attended 2 more social events that fortnight, the Carrington Garden Party and a supper at the Randolphs, and she did not position herself near the east windows. She moved through the rooms. She talked to people she had been politely avoiding, not out of dislike, but out of the habit of retreat she had built around herself over 3 years. She danced at the Carrington party, not with William, who was not there, and not with Nathaniel, who never asked, but with Colonel Morfield's young nephew, who was 18 and terrified and needed rescuing from the wall he'd been pressed against. And she talked to him about horses and made him laugh, and afterward felt herself, like herself. She had not felt entirely like herself in a long time. What she hadn't anticipated was how visible this was. The county noticed. Virginia's social fabric was tight, and its observers were sharp. And what they observed was this Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford, who had always been lovely and correct and utterly unobtrusive, was no longer unobtrusive. She was talking more, laughing, more, moving through rooms with something that could only be called presence. And she had been seen twice receiving the Boston lawyer at Ashford Manor, which was entirely proper, but which was the kind of entirely proper that people discussed over tea with a certain significant tone. Nathaniel heard the tone. He heard it from John Hartwell at the courthouse one afternoon, delivered in the careful phrasing of a man who is not quite warning a friend, but is definitely not doing anything else either. He heard it from his cousin Margaret at the Randolph supper more directly, because Margaret was always direct with him in a way that other people were not, being the one member of his family who had never been impressed by the Ashford name. "People are talking about Elizabeth," Margaret said to him, catching him in the hallway between the dining room and the sitting room at the Randolphs, in the brief window when they were alone. "People talk about everything," he said. "People are talking about her and the Carter man from Boston," Margaret said. "I'm not saying it means anything. I'm saying people are talking, and you should know it, because you are evidently the last person in the county to be paying attention to your own wife." He looked at her. Margaret Ashford was 42 and had never married and had opinions about everything, and he had spent 20 years finding her exhausting, and the past 5 minutes understanding exactly why his mother had loved her best of all his father's relatives. "I pay attention," he said. Margaret looked at him with an expression he recognized as the Virginia equivalent of absolute disbelief expressed with total social composure. "When did she start riding alone?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "When did she last ask you for something?" Margaret continued. "When did she tell you she was unhappy? When did she stop telling you, Nathaniel? Because you should find out the answer to that last one in particular, and you should be very afraid of it. And I say that as the person who loves you most in this family." She left him standing in the hallway. He stood there for a moment in the yellow light from the Randolph's hallway lamp, with the sound of 30 people talking in the next room, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a man when someone has said something true to him and he has no immediate defense. He came to find her. That night at the Randolph supper, for the first time in 3 years, Nathaniel Ashford came to find his wife. Not because she was missing or because he needed her for some social purpose. He came across a crowded room directly and deliberately and stood beside her, where she was talking to 2 women near the fireplace, and did not interrupt, and waited until the conversation reached a natural pause, and then said to her, not to the room, "Elizabeth, would you walk with me?" The 2 women exchanged a glance that Elizabeth caught, and that Nathaniel almost certainly did not. She said, "Excuse me," to the women, and turned to her husband and walked with him. He took her to the far end of the Randolphs' long front hallway, where the family portraits hung, and the noise from the party was muffled, and they had a small, strange pocket of privacy. He stood facing her, and she waited, and he did what she had not seen him do in 3 years. He struggled. Openly. Not dramatically, not with any loss of his characteristic composure, but with the visible effort of a man reaching for words he doesn't keep ready to hand. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer me honestly." "I'm always honest with you, Nathaniel," she said. "You've just not always asked me questions that required it." He absorbed that. "Are you happy here?" She looked at him. The word happy was so much larger than content, it had a different quality, a different weight. It was the kind of word a man used when he was starting to understand what the right question was. "I don't know," she said. And then, because she was her mother's daughter and she was not going to waste a moment of genuine attention on a managed answer, "I'm good at this life. I'm capable and organized, and I manage this household better than anyone you could find. I know that. But capable is not happy, and I think you know that, and I think you've known it for a while and found it easier not to ask." He said nothing. "I'm not saying that to hurt you," she said. "I'm saying it because you asked honestly and you deserve an honest answer." She paused. "Do you understand the difference between being present in a room and being seen in it?" "I'm beginning to," he said very quietly. "William Carter spent 2 hours in my sitting room last week," she said. He knew this. She had told him casually the evening after, not as a confession, but as information the way she told him about the household accounts. "In those 2 hours, he asked me 15 questions and listened to every answer. Not to be clever, not to make an impression, because he was actually curious about what I thought." She looked at him steadily. I had forgotten what that felt like. Nathaniel Ashford was a man who had never in his adult life been at a loss for what to do next. He had been managing things, land, money, people, situations, since he was 19 years old. And he was very good at it, and the goodness of it had given him a particular kind of certainty that he carried everywhere, like a second spine. He did not have that certainty right now. "I don't know how to," he started and stopped. "I know," she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "I don't know how to change what I don't." He stopped again. She waited. "I didn't know," he said finally, and it came out something between a statement and a confession, rough-edged, in a way his words never were. "I didn't know you were. I thought you were. I believed that you were." He stopped. Started over. "I thought because you were managing that you were well, that things were well." "Things were managed," she said. "There's a difference. Elizabeth." Her name in his voice said like that, not as a summons, not as an address, but as something that needed to be said, stopped both of them. He looked at her. "I don't want you to be managing, in that way. I don't want that to be what this is." "What do you want it to be?" she asked. And this was the question, the real one. The one that had been sitting in the hallway between them for 3 years. He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said. But not this. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise or a plan or any of the things a woman in a story was supposed to receive from the man who was finally paying attention. But it was true. She could hear that it was true. And Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford had spent 3 years receiving managed, careful, correct untruths, and she knew the difference. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. They stood in the hallway for another moment. 2 people in the same house, for the first time in a long time really in it together. Even if only for a moment, even if it was only a hallway between the portraits and the noise. Then the sounds of the party surged back. A burst of laughter. Someone calling someone else's name. And the moment passed and they walked back separately the way they always did, and the evening continued. But something had happened. Small, private, contained but real. And Elizabeth lying awake that night, for the second time in 2 weeks, with the Virginia summer heavy and humming outside her window, thought about the word want. He had used that word, not should or ought or what is proper. He had said want. She pressed her hand flat on the mattress beside her, felt it, breathed. She was not going to make that into more than it was. She was too careful for that, too honest. But she was also not going to make it less than it was, which was the thing she'd been doing for 3 years, making everything less than it was so that she could bear it. She thought about William Carter and his book and his 15 questions. She thought about Nathaniel in the hallway and the sound of her name in his voice when it was used like that for the first time. She did not try to choose between those 2 things, because they were not the same kind of thing, and could not be chosen between with any honesty. But she thought, I am not invisible anymore. Something has shifted. I don't know what comes next. But I am here in this life, in this house, and I am not going to disappear into the management of it. Not anymore. Outside, the summer breathed. Inside, Elizabeth Ashford stayed awake a long time and let herself want things, and did not tell herself to stop. The talk started as talk always did in Virginia with the women. Not the sharp-tongued, obvious kind of gossip that a person could defend against. not the outright accusation or the pointed question asked in front of witnesses. It was subtler than that. It was the particular Virginia variety of social destruction that arrived wearing the face of concern. A lowered voice, a hand pressed briefly on an arm, a statement disguised as a question. "I'm only saying this because I care about you naturally." Elizabeth first heard it from the least likely source. She was at the Randolph Ladies' Sewing Circle, a monthly gathering she attended, not because she loved sewing circles, but because she understood that a woman who absented herself from the social obligations of her position gave other women permission to fill that absence with speculation. And she was sitting beside old Mrs. Hartwell, who was 70 and direct in the way that only very old women and very young children could be, when Mrs. Hartwell set down her needlework and said, without preamble, "My dear people are beginning to talk nonsense about you and that Boston boy, and I think you ought to know it." Elizabeth kept her needle moving. "I see," she said. "I've shut it down twice this week." Mrs. Hartwell continued, which was as close to declaring herself an ally as the old woman ever came. "But you know how it is. The more you shut it down, the more people think there's something worth shutting down." "And what are people saying?" Elizabeth asked with the careful composure of a woman who already knows the answer and needs to hear it said aloud anyway. "That you've been receiving him too often. That Nathaniel doesn't know. That you seem—" Mrs. Hartwell paused, and the pause had weight in it. "Different lately, lighter. And that it started around the time Mr. Carter arrived." Elizabeth set down her own needlework. She looked at her hands for a moment, steady both of them, which pleased her because she felt less steady than she looked. "Nathaniel knows exactly when Mr. Carter has called," she said. "I told him each time. He raised no objection." "I know that," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I'm not suggesting you've done anything wrong. I'm suggesting that in this county, the appearance of a thing can cause just as much damage as the thing itself, and that there are women in this room right now who would be very pleased to see Nathaniel Ashford's wife have her name dragged through the summer." Elizabeth looked up. Across the circle of women bent over their needlework, she could see two faces that did not quite meet her eye. Mrs. Clarissa Wentworth, who had 3 unmarried daughters, and had always found Elizabeth's position in the county professionally irritating, and young Mrs. Pryor, who was new to Virginia society and was learning it seemed that the fastest way to gain standing was to borrow it from someone else's downfall. "Thank you," Elizabeth said to Mrs. Hartwell with genuine warmth. "I mean that." "I know you do," the old woman said, and picked up her needlework again, and that was that. But it wasn't that, and Elizabeth knew it wasn't. She sat in that circle for another hour, with her spine perfectly straight, and her expression perfectly pleasant, and her mind working with the particular cold precision it produced, when she was genuinely alarmed, sorting through what she knew and what she had to do about it. Because this was the thing about her world, about any world she suspected, but certainly about this one, that the things a woman did were always less powerful than the things people believed she did, and the things people believed were constructed not from evidence, but from narrative. And the narrative about Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford had just shifted into something dangerous. She was going to have to do something about William Carter. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was not going to let the story other people were telling about her become the story that mattered. She told him herself. That was the thing she decided in the carriage home from the sewing circle, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and the summer moving past the windows in the particular heavy gold of a Virginia afternoon. She was not going to stop seeing him without explanation, because she respected him too much for that, and because disappearing without a word was the act of someone who was guilty and knew it. But she was going to be honest with him, the way she was honest with everyone, and she was going to make a decision, and she was going to make it herself. She wrote him a note that evening. Not long, not performed. She asked him to call the following morning if he could. She had something she wished to say to him in person, because she felt he deserved that. He came at 10 the next morning, and when she told him directly, simply, without softening it, more than was kind, that the visit frequency had created talk, and that she needed to be careful of it, not for her own pride, but because she was not willing to hand the county's gossips a weapon they could use against her husband, or against him, or against the ordinary. Good thing their friendship had been. He listened with the whole attention she had come to expect from him. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I should have been more careful." "We both should," she said. "I'm not assigning blame." "I know you're not." He paused. "I want you to know something. What I value about our conversations, what I think is real about them, is entirely separate from anything that could be used as ammunition by anyone. I want you to know that I know the difference." He looked at her steadily. "And I want you to know that if stepping back is what protects you, then that's what I'll do, without any reservation." She believed him. She believed him the way she had believed him from the beginning, because he was consistent, and because consistency was the thing she trusted most. "It's not about stepping back entirely," she said. "It's about being sensible, which we can both be." "We can," he agreed. And then, because he was who he was, he said, "How are you not in a social way, actually?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm more awake than I've been in a long time, which is not entirely comfortable, but I think it's necessary." "Good," he said simply. She almost said more. She almost told him about the hallway at the Randolph supper and the word want, used in a voice she had not heard before. But she caught herself because some things were private not out of shame, but out of the particular kind of care you had to take with things that were still fragile. She kept it. She held it inside herself the way you hold a thing you're not ready to look at directly yet. "Thank you," she said instead, "for being the kind of person it's possible to say these things to." "Thank you," he said, "for saying them." What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing because it happened in a place she wasn't, was what happened between Nathaniel and William Carter the following afternoon. She found out about it 3 days later, and when she did, she sat very still for a long time before she trusted herself to move. Nathaniel had gone to the Hartwells on a matter of land boundary questions, a legal technicality that required the kind of formal document that the county surveyor had been slow to produce, and he needed to review some records that John Hartwell had access to. William Carter was there, as he often was, the Hartwells' house being his current residence and their library being his current office. Nathaniel arrived in the late afternoon and was shown to the Hartwells' study, where John Hartwell was waiting, and where, as it turned out, William Carter was also present, reviewing his own papers at the far end of the table. John Hartwell, who was both a good man and a man who understood that he was witnessing something that might require careful handling, excused himself almost immediately. Something about needing a specific document from another room, and did not come back for 20 minutes. The only person who told Elizabeth what happened in those 20 minutes was Nathaniel himself. He told her that night at supper, the meal they usually ate in the same room, while looking at different things, except that on this particular evening he sat down and waited for the soup to be served, and then, after Mrs. Delacroix withdrew, looked directly at his wife and said, "I spoke with William Carter today." She set down her spoon. "I know you've met him before." "This was different," he said. "This was I spoke with him, deliberately." She waited. "I told him," Nathaniel said with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing every word like he's picking footing on uncertain ground, "that I was aware of his friendship with you, and that I wanted to understand what kind of man he was." Something moved through her. It was not quite anger. It was not quite fear. It was the particular feeling of a woman who has been managed however gently by the men around her, and who is trying to determine whether this is different or whether it is more of the same thing. "And what did he say?" she asked. "He said that you were one of the finest people he had ever encountered," Nathaniel said, "and that he had done nothing to dishonor you, and had no intention of doing so." He paused. "And then he said something that I've been thinking about ever since." She waited. "He said, 'Your wife is remarkable, Mr. Ashford. I suspect you know that. I hope you know it in time.'" The room was very quiet. Elizabeth picked up her spoon. Set it down again. She was not going to cry at the supper table. She was absolutely not going to cry at the supper table. She pressed her hands flat on the tablecloth and breathed once steadily and looked at her husband. "And what did you say to that?" she asked. "Nothing," Nathaniel said. I didn't have an answer. He looked at her. Something was different in his face. Not soft exactly, because he was not a soft-faced man, but open. More open than she had seen it. I've been thinking about what the answer ought to be. For 3 days. I still don't have it. Nathaniel, I'm not asking you to do anything, he said quickly. Almost sharply, but not in the way that closed things down, in the way of a man who is afraid of being misunderstood. I'm not making a demand. I just wanted you to know that I heard him, and that I'm thinking. She looked at him across the long table. The long, terrible table that she had eaten 3 years of meals across, in the silence that had eaten away at her so gradually, she had almost stopped noticing the taste of it. All right, she said. All right, he said. They finished supper. But the silence that night was a different quality of silence than it had been before. It was the silence of two people who had said things and were sitting with them. Not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say. Elizabeth noticed the difference. She held it carefully, the way she held all the fragile things. What happened the following week was the thing that cracked the surface of it entirely, and it came as the worst things always did from a direction she wasn't watching. It was the Wentworth garden party. Mrs. Clarissa Wentworth, whose face Elizabeth had noted across the sewing circle, who had daughters to place, and scores to settle, and 30 years of practiced social cruelty behind her. The Wentworths hosted a summer garden party annually, and it was an event that everyone of standing attended, because not attending was its own kind of social statement, and Elizabeth had never in 3 years given anyone grounds to make statements about her by her absence. She went. Nathaniel went with her, which was usual. They arrived together, which was usual. He moved toward his business conversations, which was usual. But he was closer than usual. She noticed this without looking directly at it. He was not far. Not the way he was typically not far, which was to say that he was technically in the same party, but effectively absent. He was aware of her. She could feel it without quite being able to point to it. A quality of attention directed her way that was new enough to notice. She was talking to a group of women near the garden's central path. Women she liked, genuinely. The county doctor's wife and 2 of the younger married women, who were intelligent and funny, and hadn't yet been filed down to social smoothness by too many years of parties like this one, when Mrs. Wentworth appeared. Mrs. Clarissa Wentworth was 55 years old and had all the qualities that a certain kind of powerful woman developed when she had spent her life in a world that only gave her power through social means. She was precise and charming and relentlessly observant, and she had an ability to say the most cutting things with an expression of absolute benevolent concern that Elizabeth had always found professionally impressive, even when it was aimed at someone she liked. Today, it was aimed at Elizabeth. Mrs. Ashford, she said, arriving at the group with the smooth momentum of a woman who had decided to do something and was doing it. How lovely you look as always. We've missed you lately. I feel I hardly see you anymore, though I suppose that's not quite true. Is it? I hear you've been... A small pause, so brief and so loaded, it was almost an art form. Occupied. The group went very slightly still. The way a room goes still when something sharp has been set on the table without warning. Elizabeth smiled. Summers in Virginia keep everyone occupied, she said pleasantly. How are your daughters? Mrs. Wentworth, I heard that Margaret had been unwell in the spring. It was a deflection, and they both knew it. Mrs. Wentworth accepted it with the grace of a woman who had not finished yet. Oh, she's quite recovered, thank you. All my girls are very well. She glanced around the group with the air of someone sharing something slightly regrettable. I've been meaning to ask, this is perhaps too forward of me, but I find I'm always more comfortable with directness, the Boston gentleman. Mr. Carter. He seems to have become quite a fixture, hasn't he, in certain circles. Her eyes came back to Elizabeth, not quite smiling, not quite not. Nathaniel must be so accommodating. The group was now genuinely still. The doctor's wife had found something to look at in the middle distance. One of the young married women had developed a sudden interest in her gloves. Elizabeth felt the hit of it, the particular practiced cruelty of the thing, which was not an accusation, but was worse than an accusation, because it was the shape of one wearing the clothes of a question. She felt it. And then she felt something else. She felt angry. Not the hot, visible kind of angry that Mrs. Wentworth was hoping for. Not the flustered, defensive angry that would confirm everything the insinuation implied. The cold kind. The clear kind. The kind that came from 3 years of swallowing things and suddenly being done with swallowing. "Mr. Carter is a legal associate of the Hartwells," Elizabeth said pleasantly and clearly at a volume that the group could hear, "who has called at Ashford Manor twice, with my husband's full knowledge in the context of a social friendship that is entirely unremarkable." She smiled, and the smile was warm and absolutely did not reach her eyes. "Though I understand, Mrs. Wentworth, that unremarkable things can sometimes be very difficult to leave alone." The group went fully silent. Mrs. Wentworth's expression did something complicated. It cycled through surprise, and then offense, and then the calculation of a woman determining whether she had overreached, and then the particular stillness of a person who has decided to make someone else pay for the overreach. She drew breath. "Elizabeth." The voice came from her left, not from far away. Close. Nathaniel was there. He had appeared she did not know from where, from what conversation he had extracted himself, but he was there standing at her shoulder, and he was looking at Mrs. Wentworth with the expression he used in business negotiations when someone had tried to be clever and he had decided he was done allowing it. "Clarissa," he said. His voice was even. It was always even. But there was something in the evenness that was not courtesy. "I believe I heard my wife's name." Mrs. Wentworth recovered impressively. "Nathaniel, I was just saying to Elizabeth." "I heard what you were saying to Elizabeth," he said, quietly, without any raise of tone at all, which was somehow worse than raising it. "And I appreciate that you hold our family in such warm regard." A pause. "My wife's friendships are her own concern, and I'm certain you'll agree that a woman of Elizabeth's character requires no supervision from her social circle." He looked at Mrs. Wentworth steadily. "I know you'll agree with that." It was not a question. Mrs. Wentworth smiled with all the warmth she had available, which was considerable in quantity and 0 in temperature. "Of course," she said. "Naturally, I meant nothing by it." "Of course," Nathaniel said. And then to Elizabeth, turning to her in front of everyone in a way that was deliberate and visible and impossible to misread. "My dear, I believe they're serving something cold in the house. Will you come in with me?" She looked at him. He offered her his arm. She took it. She took it, and she felt the solid reality of his arm under her hand, and she walked with him away from Mrs. Wentworth, away from the group, through the garden party, and toward the house. And the people they passed saw them, and saw something that had not been visible between them in 3 years, which was the simple, unmistakable fact of a man choosing his wife, publicly, deliberately. She waited until they were inside in the cool of the Wentworth hallway before she stopped walking. "Nathaniel." Her voice was very controlled. "I know," he said. "You didn't have to." "Yes," he said. "I did." He wasn't looking past her. He was looking at her. Directly, with the full force of his attention, which was a considerable force. "I should have been doing that for 3 years. I know that." A pause. "I don't know yet how to. I don't have the words for all of it. But I know that much." She looked at her husband. This man she had married at 21, who was impossible and closed and infuriating. And genuinely, she had always believed something more than what he showed the world, and she saw something in his face that she had waited 3 years and 2 months and 11 days to see. He was scared, not of Mrs. Wentworth, not of the gossip or the social damage. He was scared of her, of losing her, of having been for too long a man who looked straight through the most important thing in his life without seeing it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "Don't thank me," he said. "It wasn't I should have—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together briefly in the way he did when he was ordering his thoughts. "I want to do better. I'm telling you that. I don't know how to prove it yet. But I'm telling you." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "I know you are," she said finally. "And I'm listening." She meant it as exactly what it was. Not a yes, not a forgiveness, not a resolution, but a door she was leaving open because she had loved this man once in the uncomplicated way of a 21-year-old who believed in the depth she sensed in him, and she was not entirely certain she had stopped. What no one knew, what Elizabeth herself did not yet know, was that something far more serious than social gossip was building just outside the edges of their private reckoning. It had been building quietly, with the patience of water finding its level, and it was about to arrive in a way that would make Mrs. Wentworth's careful cruelties look like nothing at all. It came through Mrs. Delacroix, which meant it came with reluctance and with the particular weight of a woman who had kept a household's secrets for 20 years and had just found one she couldn't keep. She came to Elizabeth on a Thursday morning, which was a morning that had started entirely normally. Elizabeth at her accounts the summer, thick outside the windows, the house running with its usual quiet efficiency. Mrs. Delacroix knocked at the study door in her habitual way, and then came in and closed the door, which was not her habitual way, and Elizabeth put down her pen. "What is it?" she asked. Mrs. Delacroix was 60, silver-haired, and possessed of a dignity that Elizabeth had always respected. She sat down without being asked, which she had never done before, and folded her hands in her lap and said, "I need to tell you something about Mr. Delacroix, the estate steward, her husband of 30 years, the man who managed Ashford Manor's accounts and land records and tenant relations under Elizabeth's oversight, who had always been correct and efficient and slightly defensive, which she had attributed to professional pride." "Tell me," Elizabeth said. What Mrs. Delacroix told her took 15 minutes and changed everything. The accounts had been wrong for 2 years. Not by accident. The tenant farming records that Mr. Delacroix produced for Elizabeth's review every quarter were not the full records. They were a version of the records carefully adjusted to show a slightly smaller yield, a slightly higher expense, a slightly reduced profit. The difference, the actual difference, had been going somewhere. Mrs. Delacroix had found the records by accident in a locked box she hadn't known about, when her husband had been taken ill 2 weeks ago and she had needed to find his correspondence. She had spent 2 weeks deciding what to do. She had chosen Elizabeth. Elizabeth sat with this for a long moment after Mrs. Delacroix finished. The study was very quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. Someone in the kitchen dropped something and called an apology. "How much?" Elizabeth asked. Mrs. Delacroix told her. It was significant. Not catastrophic. Nathaniel Ashford's estate was too large to be made vulnerable by any single source of loss, but it was significant, and it had been ongoing, and it had been conducted under Elizabeth's oversight, which meant that if it came to light, the question of how she had not seen it would be the first question anyone asked. "Does your husband know you've told me this?" Elizabeth asked. "No," Mrs. Delacroix said. "Does anyone else know?" "No." Elizabeth looked at this woman across the desk. This woman who had been in this house for 20 years, who had managed it with her, who had on some level been part of the machinery of a fraud that had been running beneath their feet, and she felt no anger at her, only something like clarity, the hard, clean kind. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, "for telling me." Mrs. Delacroix's composure, which had been remarkable throughout, finally cracked slightly at the edges. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know, I should have seen it sooner, I should have—" "You told me now," Elizabeth said. "That's what matters." She waited until Mrs. Delacroix left. Then she sat alone with the closed records and the open truth, and she thought with great precision and speed about what she was going to do. She was going to tell Nathaniel. That was the only possible choice, and she didn't waste time on any other option. But she was going to tell him, having already begun to address it, having already identified what she knew, what she could document, and what steps needed to be taken. She was not going to bring him a problem. She was going to bring him a problem and its solution, because that was who she was, and because she had been managing this estate alone for 3 years, while he managed everything else. And this was the consequence of that arrangement being allowed to stand unchecked. She spent 4 hours in the study. She went through 3 years of accounts with the attention of a woman who understood numbers the way most people understood language, fluently, instinctively, with an ear for what was wrong. She found everything. She documented it clearly and completely in her own handwriting in the ledger that was hers. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the library, which was where he went in the late afternoons. She knocked and opened the door without waiting, which she had never done, and he looked up from his desk with the quick attention of a man who has learned to look up quickly when his wife enters a room. She set the ledger on his desk. "There is something you need to know," she said, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. And whatever he saw in her face made him lean back in his chair and give her his full undivided attention, the same quality of attention he gave to things that mattered most to him. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He did not interrupt. He did not express the anger that she could see building in him, controlled, contained, directed inward at himself for not having seen it as much as outward at the man who had done it. He listened. He went through the ledger when she finished methodically confirming what she had documented. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You found all of this today. This afternoon. You've documented it completely." "Yes." "You know what the next steps are." "I do," she said. "We'll need a lawyer. A trustworthy one, not local because the Delacroix family has connections throughout the county. We'll need to review the tenant agreements against these records. And we'll need to make a decision about what to do with the information before it becomes information other people have." He looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been standing next to for 3 years and are only now finally seeing clearly. "Elizabeth," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. Not unkindly, but with the firmness of a woman who knows when a man is about to say something that needs to wait until they are not in the middle of a crisis. "Later. Right now we need to talk about Delacroix." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you think we should do." She sat down across from him. She opened to the first page of her documentation. And she talked, and he listened, really listened with all of himself, in a way he had never done, and they worked through it together, the two of them across the desk in the library, while the summer evening gathered outside and the house settled around them. And in the middle of it, somewhere between the third document and the fourth, Nathaniel reached across the desk and touched her hand. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just his hand on hers briefly for a moment before he withdrew it and returned to the page. But she felt it. She felt it all the way through. They had a long way to go. She knew that. The accounting of this marriage was more complex than any ledger she had ever managed, and the errors in it were not the kind you could simply correct with better documentation. But sitting there across that desk, in that library, working through something real together for the first time, she understood that the thing she had been afraid was gone for good was not in fact entirely gone. It was just going to require work. She was not afraid of work. She never had been. She turned to the next page and kept going. They sent for a lawyer from Richmond. Nathaniel's decision made the same evening. Elizabeth laid the ledger on his desk, was clean and fast, in the way his decisions always were, once he understood the full shape of a problem. He did not want a local man, Elizabeth had said as much, and she was right. She was almost always right about people and their entanglements, which was something he was understanding with a clarity that arrived too late and then didn't stop arriving. He sent a writer to Richmond before dark with a letter to a man named Horace Blaine, an attorney of 30 years' experience and a reputation for discretion that had been tested by harder things than a Virginia land fraud. Mr. Delacroix was not told. This was Elizabeth's suggestion, and Nathaniel accepted it immediately because she explained it simply. The moment Delacroix knew they were looking, the records would begin to change. They needed to let him believe that nothing had shifted, that the household moved as it always moved, that Elizabeth was at her accounts, and Nathaniel was at his meetings, and everything between them was as unremarkable as it had always appeared. They needed 1 week, maybe 2. What they needed, in other words, was for both of them to perform a normalcy that did not currently exist. They were surprisingly good at it. Elizabeth went about her mornings as she always had. She reviewed the accounts that Delacroix produced with the same composed attention she always brought to them, and she gave nothing away, not by expression, not by question, not by the smallest deviation in her manner toward him. She had always been polite to him. She remained polite. She had always been precise with him about numbers. She remained precise. Only she knew that the precision she was applying now was different, that she was building a second silent record of everything she saw, cataloging the discrepancies between what she knew to be true and what he continued to present as truth. She thought, better at this than she had any reason to be. Her mother would have said something dry about that. Nathaniel, for his part, did something that surprised her. He told her where he was going. Every morning before he left to the fields, to the courthouse, to whatever business required him, he stopped at the door of whichever room she was in and told her where he'd be. Not because she needed to know exactly, and not as a formal accounting of his schedule, but the way you tell someone where you're going when they matter to you, and you've recently remembered that they matter. She did not make a thing of it. She said, "Thank you," or "I'll see you at supper," or sometimes simply nodded. But she noted it. She filed it alongside the other things she was noting about him, building a quiet ledger of small evidence as careful and as honest as the one she'd built about Delacroix, because she was that kind of woman, and she was not going to pretend she wasn't. Mr. Blaine arrived on the 5th day traveling quietly, which was what Nathaniel had asked for, and was shown to the library without fanfare. He was 60 compact, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable about 20 years back, and had stayed that way, not unkind, just opaque in the manner of a man who had heard everything and stopped reacting visibly to most of it. Elizabeth was in the library when he arrived. She had been there for an hour, her own documentation spread before her. Nathaniel came in directly behind Mr. Blaine and did not suggest she leave, which she noticed, and which Mr. Blaine noticed, and which set the tone for everything that followed. "Mrs. Ashford compiled the primary documentation," Nathaniel said. "She should be present for this." Mr. Blaine looked at Elizabeth. She looked back at him. "You did this work yourself?" he asked. "I manage the household accounts," she said. "I've done so for 3 years, which is in part how this was possible to miss. The records I was given were adjusted before they reached me." He sat down and reviewed her documentation for 20 minutes without speaking. She watched him read and did not fill the silence, because she had learned a long time ago that silence in professional settings was not an invitation to speak. Nathaniel stood near the window, which was where he stood when he was containing something he had not fully resolved. "This is thorough," Mr. Blaine said finally. He did not add for a woman, which she appreciated more than she would have been able to easily explain. "It's complete," she said. "Every discrepancy is sourced." "It is," he agreed. He set the last page down and folded his hands. "Mr. Ashford, you understand that this will need to be handled carefully. A public accusation before the documentation is fully secured risks giving Mr. Delacroix time to produce counterclaims. The strongest approach is to complete the evidentiary record first, then confront." "How long?" Nathaniel asked. "A week. Perhaps less if Mrs. Ashford can continue to monitor without alerting him." "She can," Nathaniel said with a certainty that he had not asked her about. She looked at him across the room. She found she agreed with his certainty. "I can," she confirmed. Mr. Blaine left the manor the same way he arrived, quietly, with Elizabeth's documentation and a clear set of next steps. Nathaniel closed the library door and turned. They were alone. The afternoon light came through the windows, and the room smelled like old books and beeswax, and the particular quality of a conversation that has just ended and left something behind it. "You didn't have to tell him it was my work," she said. "It was your work," Nathaniel said. "You could have presented it as your own, and it would have been simpler." He looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, the closest she had ever seen him come to impatience with himself. "I don't want it to be simpler," he said. "I want it to be true." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said quietly. He nodded. Then, "Elizabeth, are you sleeping?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, so outside the register of anything he had asked her in years, that it took her a moment to answer it. "Not well," she said honestly. "No." he said. They stood on opposite sides of the library. The space between them was the same space it had always been geographically, but it felt different now. Less empty, more like a distance that could in theory be crossed. Neither of them crossed it yet, but they both knew it was there. The week that followed was the strangest of Elizabeth's married life, which was saying something. On the surface, nothing changed. The household ran. She managed. Nathaniel conducted his business. They ate breakfast at the long table and supper at the long table, and the days had their familiar architecture. Mr. Delacroix moved through the estate with his usual air of quiet authority, presenting his weekly summary to Elizabeth on Thursday morning as he always did, and she received it with the same composed attention she always had, and thanked him, and waited for him to leave before she added his new adjustments to the document she was building. Beneath the surface, everything had changed. Nathaniel came to breakfast and sat down and talked to her. Not about business, not about the estate's operational requirements. He talked to her. He asked her things. He asked about the Methodist school which she had been funding quietly for a year, and when she explained what they were building, he listened with the full attention he had given Mr. Blaine's legal analysis. He asked about the tenant families whose names she knew, and he did not, and she told him. He asked about her mother, what Frances Whitmore had been like, what she had taught her, what Elizabeth had inherited from her, that she found most valuable, and this conversation lasted 2 entire breakfasts, and ran long into territory that Elizabeth had not expected, because she had not expected him to ask. "Why are you asking me this?" she said on the second morning, not with suspicion, but with the genuine curiosity of a woman who is trying to understand a change she can see but cannot fully account for. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I don't know the answers, and I should." He looked at his coffee. "I should have asked years ago. I know that. I'm not pretending that asking now erases that." He looked up. "But I'm asking now." She considered him. She thought about the woman she had been at the breakfast table 11 days ago, who had set down a cold cup of coffee and walked out with her spine straight and her resolve made. She thought about how far 11 days could move things, and how far they couldn't. "It doesn't erase it," she said. "But I'd rather you ask late than not at all." He accepted that. He did not flinch from it, or soften it, or try to make it into something more forgiving. He just accepted it, and she thought not for the first time recently that there was something in him she had been right about all those years ago. Something real. The problem had never been that it wasn't there. The problem had been that neither of them had known how to reach it. On the 9th day, Mr. Blaine sent word. The supplemental documentation was complete. He would be returning the following afternoon, and he recommended that the confrontation with Mr. Delacroix be conducted immediately after his arrival, while the evidence was fresh and the element of surprise intact. Elizabeth spent the morning of that 10th day in her usual routine, managing the household, reviewing Mr. Delacroix's schedules, speaking to him once about the tenant harvest projections, and once about a fence line on the eastern property. She was composed and correct, and she gave nothing away, and when he left the second conversation, she stood for a long moment in the hallway and allowed herself to feel what she felt, which was a complicated mixture of steadiness and a very old, very deep anger that she had been keeping at a measured temperature for a long time. It was not just about the money. She had understood this from the first night when she sat alone with Mrs. Delacroix's confession and the closed ledger. It was about 3 years of being trusted with the management of this household while someone used that trust as a blind. It was about the accounts she had reviewed every quarter, with the care and diligence she brought to everything she did, and the quiet satisfaction she had taken in the order of them, and the fact that the order had been an illusion. Someone had used her competence as cover for his dishonesty, and she had not seen it. And that fact, that particular targeted wound to the thing she was most certain of about herself, was the sharpest part of all of it. She breathed it out, walked to the kitchen, had a cup of tea with Cook, who was a woman of 60, who had been at Ashford Manor longer than either Elizabeth or Nathaniel, and who had opinions about everything, and shared them freely, and who made Elizabeth laugh twice genuinely, which was better than any other preparation for the afternoon. Mr. Blaine arrived at 2. By 3, The three of them, Nathaniel, Elizabeth, and Mr. Blaine, were ready, and at 3:15 Mr. Delacroix was asked to come to the library. He came with his usual manner, the slight forward tilt of a man accustomed to being of use, the professional composure of someone who has conducted this kind of meeting 100 times on the other side of the desk. He saw Mr. Blaine and recalibrated slightly. He saw Elizabeth seated to Nathaniel's left with her hands folded on the table, and something shifted in his face. Something so small and so quickly managed that a less attentive person would have missed it entirely. Elizabeth did not miss it. She filed it. Nathaniel spoke first. He laid the facts on the table the way he laid everything directly, without theater, without prelude. He said what had been found and what it represented and what had been confirmed. He set Mr. Blaine's documentation in front of Mr. Delacroix and gave him time to look at it. Mr. Delacroix looked at it. His face moved through several expressions, all of them managed, none of them fully successful. He looked up. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, and his tone was careful. "I wonder if there may be errors in the interpretation of—" "The documentation is mine," Elizabeth said. "I compiled it from the source records over 9 days. There are no errors in interpretation." She met his eyes. "I'd be happy to walk through each one with you if you believe there's a discrepancy I've missed." He did not ask her to do that, because there was nothing to find, and they both knew it. "Nathaniel," he said, turning away from her, and this small turn away from her as if she were the opening argument, and he was moving to the authority, made something in Elizabeth go very still and very certain. "We have known each other for 20 years. Surely." "Elizabeth found this," Nathaniel said. His voice was even. "Elizabeth documented it. Elizabeth is the person you should be speaking to." Delacroix looked at him. A long moment. "I see," he said quietly. "I hope you do," Nathaniel said. What followed was an hour of the careful, controlled legal process that Mr. Blaine managed with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before and would do it again. There was no shouting. There was no drama in the visible sense. Mr. Delacroix confirmed in the end because the documentation left no alternative, and because Nathaniel made clear quietly, with the authority of a man who controlled more land and resources than any other person in the county. That cooperation was the only path that did not end in public proceedings. He left the library an hour after he had entered it. Elizabeth sat at the table for a moment after the door closed. Mr. Blaine was organizing his papers. Nathaniel was standing near the window. The afternoon light had shifted. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked. She considered the question with the honesty she gave everything. "I'm angry," she said. "I've been managing those accounts with every bit of care I have. He used that. He used my carefulness as a place to hide." She paused. "That's the part that's going to take some time." "I know," he said. "And I'm—" She stopped, chose the next word carefully. "I'm proud of the work, of finding it." She looked at her hands on the table. "I needed to say that." "You should be proud," he said, simply, without performance. "You are the finest thing about this estate, Elizabeth. I don't say that to be kind. I say it because it's accurate, and I'm sorry that it took me this long to say it." She looked at him. Mr. Blaine had gone very still at his papers, with the professional sensitivity of a man who knows when to be temporarily deaf. She said, "Nathaniel, I'm not asking you to accept that as sufficient," he said. "I know it isn't. I'm asking you to hear it. Just hear it." She heard it. She sat with it. She let it be real without trying to resolve it into something she knew what to do with. "I hear it," she said. He nodded. He looked at Mr. Blaine. "Horace, what do we need to do next?" And they went back to the work, the two of them side by side. The news moved through the county the way these things moved, faster than light, slower than understanding. By the end of that week, it was known that Mr. Delacroix had been removed from his position at Ashford Manor under circumstances that no one was quite willing to describe directly, which meant that everyone was describing them indirectly and with tremendous enthusiasm. The details were not public. Nathaniel had been deliberate about that, but the shape of it was clear enough, and the county understood that something significant had happened, and that Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford had been at the center of it. Elizabeth felt the shift in the room at the Carrington dinner that Friday. Not negative, the opposite. There was a quality of attention directed at her that was different from anything she had felt in 3 years of being Mrs. Ashford. It was respect. Not the polite surface variety that her position had always commanded. The real kind. The kind that has a little bit of surprise in it and a little bit of recalibration. The way people look at someone they thought they understood and have suddenly understood differently. Mrs. Hartwell found her early in the evening and pressed her hand without a word, which was more than enough. William Carter was there. He had heard, she could see it in his expression when he greeted her. Not the news exactly, but something of the texture of the past 2 weeks, the way news traveled in this county loosely and in fragments. He bowed to her with the formality that was always also warmth in him, and said quietly, "I understand, some things have happened at the manor." "Some things have," she said. "Are you well?" "I am," she said. "Better than I've been, I think." He looked at her for a moment, that direct look she had always trusted, and said, "Good." And then, "You look it. Not just well, more yourself." "I feel more myself," she said honestly. He nodded. He understood what that meant without requiring an explanation, which was one of the things she had always valued about him. And then he said, "I'll be leaving Virginia in 10 days. The legal matter is resolved. I'll be going back to Boston." She had known this was coming. It was still a small thing to hear it said. "I'll be sorry to lose your conversation," she said, "and I yours." He paused. I hope things are going the right way, Mrs. Ashford. For you, whatever the right way looks like." "I think they might be," she said. "I'm not certain yet, but I think they might be." He bowed. He moved away, and she watched him go, and felt clean about it. She had been afraid she would feel something complicated when the moment came, and instead, it was clean. He had been what he was: genuine, honest, respectful good, and his time in Virginia had been what it was, which was someone who had looked at her and shown her what it felt like to be looked at, and who had consequently, entirely without intending it, reminded her of what she had a right to want. She would not have chosen what had happened without him. She was honest enough to know that. She was also honest enough to know that what she wanted was standing across the room talking to John Hartwell, and had looked up twice in the past 5 minutes to find her. Nathaniel found her near the end of the evening, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he found her before she found him. And what was more unusual was what he asked. "Would you like to stay?" he said. They were near the door, not departing, not yet, but close to it, and the question was specific. The dancing had started in the Carringtons' great room, and Virginia evenings at their best ended in music. "Or would you rather go home?" She looked at him. "You don't dance," she said. "I know how to dance," he said. "I choose not to typically. That's different." A small pause. "Would you like to dance?" she asked. Something in his expression moved. Not the surface movement of a performed feeling, but something underneath the slow, difficult movement of a man who has spent 34 years building walls around himself, encountering one he is ready to take down. "I would like to ask you," he said, "if you're willing. I'm aware that I don't have a great deal of standing to ask it from." She thought about 3 years. She thought about cold coffee and silent carriage rides and the particular loneliness of being invisible to the person who was supposed to know you best. She thought about the ledger she had compiled and the hallway at the Randolphs, and his hand on hers across the desk in the library, brief, unannounced, and real. She thought about what it cost a man like Nathaniel Ashford to stand in front of his wife and say, "I would like to ask you." She was fair enough to count that. "You have some standing," she said. "Not a great deal, but some." He looked at her steadily. "Is that enough to ask?" She took a breath. "Ask," she said. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. His hand, the one she had taken in a carriage on her wedding day, the one that had handed her down from horses and offered her the practiced courtesy of a man performing duty. The same hand now offered differently, not with duty, with something that cost him. She took it. The Carringtons' great room was full and warm, and the fiddles were playing the kind of reel that Virginia summer nights were made for, and Nathaniel Ashford led his wife onto the floor, and she went, and they danced, not perfectly, because he had not danced in years, and she had spent 3 years dancing with other people's nephews, but genuinely, together, and the room noticed. The room absolutely noticed. But Elizabeth was not looking at the room. She was looking at her husband, who was looking at her, and neither of them were looking past each other. "I'm going to get this wrong," he said low under the music, meaning the dancing, but meaning more than the dancing. "I know," she said. "So am I sometimes. I'm going to not know the right words, often. I know that too. But He stopped, started again. "I'm not going to stop trying to find them. I need you to know that." She looked at him. This man she had married and managed around and missed without fully letting herself miss. She thought about what she had told William Carter. "I'm more awake than I've been in a long time," and she felt the truth of it here now in the warm noise of the Carrington great room with the fiddles going and Nathaniel's hand at her waist. "Then we'll manage it," she said. "The way I manage everything, carefully, with good records." He made a sound that was very close to a laugh. She had not heard him laugh in 3 years. It was a better sound than she remembered. "Good records," he said. "I'm very good at them," she reminded him. "I know," he said. "I know you are." He held her a little closer, not dramatically, not demonstratively, just a slight adjustment of distance, a small closing of the space that had existed between them for so long. "I'm beginning to understand exactly how good." She did not say anything to that. She did not need to. She danced with him, and the fiddles played, and through the windows, the Virginia summer night was thick with heat and fireflies, and the particular smell of July, and something that had been very tightly wound in Elizabeth Whitmore Ashford, something that had been winding tighter since a cold wedding anniversary morning 3 years ago, loosened one more careful, significant turn. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to breathe. William Carter left Virginia on a Tuesday morning in early August, and Elizabeth was not there to see him go. This was deliberate. Not cold. She had written him a letter, a real one, the kind she wrote when she meant every word, thanking him for his friendship and his honesty and the particular quality of attention he had brought to a woman who had needed reminding that such attention was possible. She had given it to the Hartwell servant who came to collect a final parcel for him, and she had not stood at the window to watch the road. She had gone instead to the study, to the accounts, to the work that was always there, and she had let him go the way you let go of something you are genuinely grateful for and cannot keep. She thought about him once in the afternoon of that Tuesday when the summer heat pressed down on the house and everything was still, and she was alone with her ledgers. She thought he was a good man. He was kind in the real way, not the performed way, and she hoped Boston was kind to him. Then she turned the page and kept working. Nathaniel came home that evening earlier than usual. She heard his horse in the yard, heard his voice with the stable boy. A shorter exchange than usual, which meant he was moving quickly, which meant something was on his mind. She stayed at her desk. She had learned in the past 3 weeks not to arrange herself for his arrival. She had spent 3 years not mattering enough to arrange herself, and then several more quietly doing it out of habit, and she was done with both versions. She was simply where she was when he got there, and where she was usually the study, or the sitting room, or the garden, and he was learning to find her. He knocked at the study door. She had noticed he was doing that now, knocking, where before he had simply opened doors in his own house, with the confidence of a man who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him. The knocking was small, and it was new, and she had not commented on it, but she had noted it. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, which was also new. He did not stand and conduct business from the doorway. He sat in the chair across her desk, the one Mr. Blaine had used, and he looked at her with the directness that she had always known was in him and was only now routinely receiving. "Carter's gone?" he asked. "This morning," she said. A pause. He was not asking what she felt about it. She knew, and he knew she knew that he wanted to ask, and that he had decided not to, because he had been working. She could see it in the careful restraint of the past 3 weeks, at the difference between the things he had a right to ask and the things he simply wanted to know. "Are you all right?" he said instead. She considered the question, and him, and what it cost him to ask it without asking the thing underneath it. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nodded. He looked at the papers on her desk. "Is there anything you need from me today?" "Your signature on 3 documents for Mr. Blaine. They're on the side table." He went to the side table and reviewed the documents with his usual thoroughness and signed them. He did not do it the way he had always done things in her vicinity, quickly, efficiently, with his attention already half elsewhere. He stayed at the side table and read every line, and she did not hurry him, and when he finished, he brought the signed documents back to her desk and set them down and said, "The third one, the easement on the Buckhorn parcel. You worded the renewal clause differently than Delacroix had it." "Delacroix's wording left a gap," she said. "The way he had it written, the county could have claimed access to the mill road within 12 years. The way I've written it, they can't." Nathaniel looked at the document, then at her. "How long have you known about that gap?" "About 14 months, she said. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly. He was past surprise at her capabilities, she thought, or at least getting there. More like the particular feeling of a man who keeps finding rooms in his own house he didn't know existed. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I mentioned it to Delacroix," she said. "He told me the standard wording was sufficient." She paused. "I should have brought it to you directly. I know that now." "Yes," he said simply. Not as a rebuke. As a fact they were both acknowledging. "You should have." "I'm used to managing around things," she said. "I'm working on managing through them instead." He sat back down across from her. "So am I," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the particular shared understanding of 2 people who have recently discovered they have been doing the same difficult thing in isolation and are trying to learn how to do it together. "I spoke to John Hartwell today," Nathaniel said. She looked up. John Hartwell was the kind of name that meant something specific was coming. He was Nathaniel's closest associate in the county, the man whose opinion Nathaniel valued most, which she knew not because Nathaniel had ever told her, but because she had been watching him in social settings for 3 years and knew exactly who he listened to. "About the Delacroix matter," Nathaniel continued. "Hartwell's been hearing things. Questions about how it was found, who handled it, what the timeline was." "And what did you tell him?" "The truth," Nathaniel said. "That my wife identified a discrepancy in the estate records, compiled a complete evidentiary account over 9 days without detection, and brought it to me fully resolved." He paused. He said, a brief stop in which she could see him deciding whether to say the next thing. He said it. "He said he'd always suspected you were the most capable manager in the county, and he was glad I'd finally figured it out." Elizabeth looked at him. She was not going to cry. She had decided a long time ago that she was not going to cry at her own kitchen table, or her own desk, or in front of her own husband about the things that should have been different, and she was holding to that decision. But she felt the hit of it, the accumulated weight of 3 years of being capable and invisible, and now being capable and seen, and how much space there was between those 2 things. "That was kind of him," she said carefully. "It wasn't kindness," Nathaniel said. "It was accuracy. He's not a kind man particularly. He's an accurate one." He looked at her steadily. "So am I when I'm paying attention." She held his gaze. "You are," she said, "when you're paying attention." He accepted the qualification without deflecting it. "I know," he said. "I'm working on the paying attention part." "I know you are," she said. And because she was honest, and because she was her mother's daughter, it's noticed. The thing that came next, no one saw coming. That was the nature of it, the way the last piece of the Delacroix matter surfaced, not through the careful legal process that Mr. Blaine was managing, but through a side door that none of them had been watching. It was Mrs. Pryor who brought it. Young Mrs. Pryor, who had stood in the sewing circle with her eyes on her gloves, while Mrs. Wentworth aimed her careful cruelty at Elizabeth, who had, it turned out, her own reasons for paying close attention to the proceedings at Ashford Manor. She arrived at the house on a Wednesday unannounced, which was unusual enough that Elizabeth received her with her full attention already engaged. Mrs. Pryor was 26, recently married into the county from a Richmond family, and she had the look of someone who had been carrying something for long enough that the carrying had changed her posture. She sat in the sitting room, with her hands folded too tightly, and said without preamble that she needed to speak to Elizabeth about Thomas Delacroix. Elizabeth sat very still. "Tell me," she said. What Mrs. Pryor told her was this: her husband, Robert Pryor, had purchased a parcel of land the previous year through Delacroix, who had presented himself as acting under Nathaniel Ashford's authority to negotiate the sale. The price had been inflated. The deed had a clause buried in it that Pryor had not fully understood at the time of signing. And 3 months ago, when Pryor had tried to develop the land, Delacroix had informed him that there was a complication with the title that would require additional payment to resolve. Additional payment to Delacroix. Not to any court, not to any legal entity. To Delacroix. Robert Pryor had paid it. He had told no one, not the Ashfords, not a lawyer, not John Hartwell, because he was new to the county. And Delacroix had made it clear in the particular way men like Delacroix made things clear, that making trouble about this would create more trouble than it resolved. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elizabeth asked. Mrs. Pryor met her eyes. "Because I heard what happened," she said. "Because I heard that you found it. That you were the one who put it together, and that it was real, that it wasn't just—" She stopped. "My husband didn't believe anyone would listen. He thought because Delacroix had been here 20 years, and we had been here no one would take our word against his." She paused. "But they took yours." Elizabeth felt something she did not immediately have a name for, something between anger and a very specific, very female solidarity that ran deeper than social acquaintance. She looked at this young woman who had sat in the sewing circle with her eyes down while cruelty was being performed, and understood that she had been calculating even then, watching, waiting to see which way things fell. "Does your husband know you're here?" Elizabeth asked. "No," Mrs. Pryor said. "But he'll support it, whatever you think should be done." Elizabeth stood up. "Stay here," she said. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. She went to find Nathaniel. She found him in the library and told him in 4 sentences. She watched his face while she said it, watched the controlled anger move through it, the recognition of the full shape of what Delacroix had been doing, and then the particular clarity that settled over him when he understood that this was not just an estate accounting problem anymore. This was extortion. This was a man who had used the Ashford name to defraud their neighbors. "How reliable is she?" he asked. "Completely," Elizabeth said. "She has documentation. Her husband has the original deed and the correspondence." Nathaniel was already moving. "Get Mr. Blaine," he said. "He's in Richmond until Friday." "Then send for him today." He stopped, looked at her. "Can you—" "I'll write the letter," she said. "I'll send a rider within the hour." He nodded. He looked as though he was going to say something else, and then reconsidered, and then said it anyway. "Elizabeth, I need you at the table when we do this. With the Pryors with Blaine. I need you there." She looked at him. "I'll be there," she said. Not as support," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words that do not come naturally to him. "As an equal party. This is your work as much as mine. More in some ways." She held that. "Let it be real." "All right," she said. "All right," he said. And then, because she was already turning, "Thank you. For all of it. For not—" He stopped. "You could have managed this quietly, without telling me, and resolved it, and I might never have fully understood what had happened. You didn't do that." She turned back, looked at him. "No," she said, "I didn't." "Why not?" It was a genuine question. She could see it. He actually wanted to know, not as self-reproach, but as the real curiosity of a man trying to understand the woman he had not understood for 3 years. She thought about the answer. She gave him the true one. "Because I'm done managing around you," she said. "I told you that. I meant it both ways." He stood very still. "Both ways," he repeated. "Both ways," she said. She went to write the letter. Behind her, she heard him make a sound that was low and private, and not quite a word, the sound of a man receiving something he has not been given in a long time, and is not entirely sure how to hold. She did not turn back around. She let him hold it. Mr. Blaine arrived Friday morning 24 hours after the writer reached him, which told Elizabeth something about how seriously he took the new information. He sat with the Pryors for 2 hours, Nathaniel on one side, Elizabeth on the other, exactly as Nathaniel had said, and by the end of it, the picture of what Delacroix had been doing was complete. Not just the accounts at Ashford Manor. 3 separate land transactions in the county, all conducted under the shadow of the Ashford name, all with the same buried clause and the same pattern of subsequent extortion, small enough each one to have avoided notice. Together, they were significant, and they were systematic, and they were, Mr. Blaine said in his flat, opaque way, criminal. The legal proceedings that followed were not fast. They were not dramatic in the way stories sometimes made legal proceedings dramatic. There was no single courtroom moment, no confrontation in which everything resolved in a thunderclap. It was the steady, careful work of documentation and verification and formal process, and it lasted through August and into the first cool weeks of September. Elizabeth was part of every step of it, not managing from a distance, not being consulted as a courtesy at the table with her own documentation with her voice in the room. Nathaniel made sure of that. He made sure of it in the quiet, consistent way he had begun to do things, not with announcement, not with performed gestures, but with the simple fact of it. When Mr. Blaine addressed a question to the room, Nathaniel let it land and waited to see if Elizabeth took it first. When the county circuit judge reviewed the evidence, Nathaniel introduced her as the person who had compiled the primary documentation without softening it or qualifying it. When John Hartwell attended one of the working sessions and seemed surprised to find Elizabeth seated at the table rather than providing tea, Nathaniel said, "Elizabeth found it. Elizabeth documented it. Elizabeth should be here," and then moved on before anyone could remark on it. She noticed every one of these things. She did not remark on them either, but she noticed. The change that mattered most, though, happened not in legal meetings, but at breakfast. It happened the way real things happen, slowly, and then all at once, and then quietly, so that she looked up one morning in the second week of September and realized that the long table did not feel as long as it used to. Not because anything about it had physically changed, but because Nathaniel had moved his coffee cup 1 chair closer 3 weeks ago, and then another chair closer the week after that. And this week, he was sitting near the middle of the table, and she was sitting near the middle of the table, and they were talking, not about the estate, not about legal proceedings or tenant yields or easement clauses. Talking, the way people talk when they are building the ordinary texture of a shared life about the weather and what it meant for the harvest, about a letter she had received from her cousin in Fredericksburg, about a conversation he had overheard in town that had been funny in the particular accidental way of life, not the performed way of social gatherings. About small things, the smallest things. She had never thought she would be so grateful for small things. He told her one morning about his father. Not in the way of a man making a confession or a justification, just the way of a man who had been thinking about something and arrived at the point of saying it. He said his father had been a person who understood management and authority and the correct hierarchy of obligations, and had taught him all of those things with great consistency, and had never once in his memory told his mother that she looked well in a particular dress, or asked what she had been thinking about on the ride home from a party. He said he had grown up believing this was simply how men of his kind were, and it had taken him an embarrassingly long time to understand that it was a choice. "A choice your father made," Elizabeth said carefully. "A choice I made," he said, "when I could have made another one." She set down her coffee. She looked at him, at this man who had been so opaque for so long, sitting in the September morning light, 2 chairs closer than he had been a month ago, saying true things in a low voice without any armor around them. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. The same question she had asked him once before, and she asked it again, not with suspicion, but with the genuine desire to understand. "Because you told me you were done managing around me," he said. "And I'm trying to be something worth not having to manage around." He paused. "I'm trying to show you the whole of it, not just the parts I'm comfortable with." She held that. Let it be real in all its imperfect offered weight. "Your father loved your mother," she said, not as a question. "I believe so," he said, "in the only way he knew." "And did she know it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "I hope so." He looked at his coffee, then back at her. "I want you to know it, however imperfect the knowing is." She breathed steady and clear, her mother's daughter. "I know you're trying," she said. "I see that you're trying, that Nathaniel, that matters. That is not nothing." "It's not enough," he said. "Not yet," she agreed. "But it's a beginning." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them the morning was ordinary, and the table was not so long, and it was not a declaration or a resolution, but it was something real that they were both holding together. The second twist came in late September, and it arrived the way the first one had, through a door no one was watching. A letter this time addressed to Elizabeth, not from William Carter. From a woman named Ruth Abbott in Charlottesville, who identified herself as the director of the Methodist school that Elizabeth had been quietly funding for a year. The letter was gracious and articulate, and clearly written by a woman of education. And it said that the school had over the past year expanded to 43 students, due in part to the Ashford charitable contributions, and that they were now in a position to build a second classroom, and that Mrs. Abbott wondered whether Mrs. Ashford might consider a more formal partnership, not merely funding, but involvement, guidance, a position on the school's governing board, if she was willing. Elizabeth read the letter 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, slowly feeling something shift in her chest, that she had no precise word for, something between recognition and arrival. The feeling of a door opening that you had not known was there. She had been funding the school because it needed funding, and because she could, and because her mother had cared about education, with a conviction that Elizabeth had inherited as completely as she had inherited Frances Whitmore's spine and clear eyes. She had not thought of it as building something of her own. She had not permitted herself to think of it that way. She thought of it that way now. She brought the letter to Nathaniel that evening. She did not ask his permission. She had not asked his permission for the funding, and she was not going to establish the habit of asking his permission for the use of her own mind and her own capacity. But she showed it to him because she was done managing around him, and sharing something real with someone was not the same thing as asking their permission for it. He read it carefully. When he finished, he set it on the desk and looked at her. "You've been funding this school for a year," he said, "from the charitable fund. It was within my discretion." "I know it was." He paused. "I didn't know about it." "You didn't ask," she said, not as an accusation, as the plain fact it was. He nodded. He looked at the letter again. 43 students, he said. "Ruth Abbott seems to be a very capable woman." "She does." He looked up. "What do you want to do?" She held his gaze. 3 months ago, he would have said, "Do as you think best," which was the version of permission that was also a dismissal. He was not saying that. He was asking her what she wanted. "I want to accept," she said. "I want to sit on that board. I want to be part of what that school becomes." She paused. "I also want to expand the funding more than the charitable fund will cover. I want to discuss it as a real investment from the estate." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much?" she told him. She had a number ready because she had been thinking about it since the 4th reading of the letter, and she had the specific costs already building themselves in her head the way numbers always did, tidily and with purpose. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. "All right," he said. "Draw up what you need and we'll review it with Blaine." She blinked. "That's it. You've already thought through the costs," he said with the small precision that meant he knew her by now, was learning her, was paying attention. "You had a number ready. I'm not going to pretend to deliberate about something you've already deliberated better than I would." She was not, she decided, going to make a thing of that. She was just going to let it be what it was, which was a man learning to value what he had. "Thank you," she said. "Thank yourself," he said. "It's your work." Jackie Bo. October came, in cool and gold, the way Virginia autumns did when they arrived properly, and with it came the formal resolution of the Delacroix matter. There was no trial. The evidence was sufficient, and a man of Delacroix's age and 20 years of service to the county's most prominent estate understood when Blaine laid it out with his flat precision that cooperation was the only door that led anywhere he wanted to go. Restitution was agreed to. The prior's deed was corrected. The legal record was closed. Elizabeth was there when it was finalized. She signed her name below Nathaniel's on the final document, which Mr. Blaine facilitated without comment, which told her something about how much had shifted in the county's understanding of who exactly the Ashfords were collectively in the room. Afterward, standing in the hallway outside the lawyer's office in town, Nathaniel turned to her and said, "It's done." "It's done," she agreed. They were on the street in the October morning, and Virginia was putting on its best colors, and the town was going about its business around them, and Elizabeth felt finished. Not in the way of something ending, but in the way of something completed. The specific, satisfying completion of a task that has required everything you have and has used it well. "Breakfast," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. He was not a man who suggested breakfast in town. He was not historically a man who suggested unscheduled things at all. He was suggesting it now in the ordinary, careful way of a man who has learned that ordinary, careful things are the substance of a life and not the interruption of it. "Yes," she said. They walked together down the main street of the town, and the people they passed greeted them. The Ashfords together, walking at the same pace, with the particular quality of two people who have been through something real and come out the other side of it, standing close enough to touch. Some of those people had been at the Hartwell ball in July and remembered very well what Mrs. Ashford had looked like standing alone by the east windows. None of them said so, but people noticed. People in Virginia always noticed. Elizabeth did not mind being noticed now. It was different from the noticing of invisibility, the way you notice a gap, an absence, a space where a person ought to be. This was the noticing of presence, of someone who was fully, unapologetically occupying the life that had always been hers. She had her husband beside her. She had her work and a seat on a school board and a ledger that was clean and honest, and entirely her own. She had a breakfast in town on an October morning with a man who was still learning how to say the things she needed to hear, and who was, she was increasingly certain, going to keep learning. She had, she thought, exactly enough to build from. The Ashford Winter Ball was held the second Friday of December, which was the traditional date and was always the largest event of the year. The season's grand culmination, the gathering that everyone of standing attended the evening that set the tone for everything that followed. Elizabeth organized it as she organized everything at Ashford Manor with the thoroughness and the care that she brought to all her work. She ordered the flowers and the musicians and the supper menu and the seating and the 100 small logistics that made a large evening run like something effortless, because that was what she was good at, and she had stopped feeling any ambivalence about being good at it. She wore blue, deep, deliberate Virginia winter blue, because she had spent enough summers in cream and pale colors, and she was in the mood for something that announced itself. The house was full. The county had come, all of it. It seemed the Hartwells and the Carringtons and the Randolphs and the Moorfields, the Pryors, who were no longer newly arrived but had become quietly people Elizabeth counted as genuine friends. Mrs. Hartwell, who pressed her hand at the door with the warmth of a woman who had been quietly watching something good happen and was satisfied with how it had turned out. even Mrs. Wentworth, who greeted Elizabeth with a correctness so elaborate it was its own kind of capitulation. Nathaniel moved through the evening differently than Elizabeth had ever seen him move through an evening. He was still himself, contained precise the gravitational center of any room he was in. But he was not separate from her. He came to find her twice in the first hour, not to communicate something necessary, but because he was where she was. He introduced her to two men from Richmond she had not previously met as my wife Elizabeth, who manages half of what I claim credit for, which made both men look at her with a recalibration she enjoyed more than she had expected to. She danced with 3 people in the first half of the evening. Colonel Moorfield's nephew, who had grown in confidence since the spring and now danced competently instead of desperately. John Hartwell, who was a surprisingly good dancer for a man who looked like he thought about land values in his sleep. And Robert Pryor, who thanked her quietly during the dance for what she and Nathaniel had done in the simple way of a man who means it completely and doesn't have many words for it. "Your wife came to me," Elizabeth said. "That was courage." "She said you'd understand," he said. She was right. The evening moved around them warm and loud and full of the particular life of a Virginia winter night, when a house is opened and lit and given over to the pleasure of company. Elizabeth moved through it with a quality of ease she had not felt in years at her own events. The ease of someone who is fully at home, not just managing the appearance of being at home. She was near the doorway between the supper room and the great hall when Nathaniel appeared beside her. She had known he had felt in the past months a growing accuracy in her sense of where he was, the way you develop an instinct for the location of things that matter to you. He came to stand beside her and said nothing for a moment, watching the room with her. "It's a good evening," he said. "It is," she said. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were standing in the doorway of their own house in the middle of the grandest evening of the year, and around them was everything they had built and the people who lived in the radius of their life, and between them was everything they had survived and were still surviving and would, she genuinely thought, manage to make into something real. "Elizabeth," he said. "Nathaniel," she said, and he held out his hand. Not the way he had at the Carrington party, tentative, careful, weighted with all the asking it had cost him. This was different. This was a man who had been practicing quietly and deliberately all autumn long, and had arrived at a place where the offer came from something easy, something decided. His hand open in front of her with the simple certainty of someone who was no longer afraid of being refused. She looked at his hand. She felt the whole weight of the years, the cold mornings and the long table and the pearl necklace chosen by someone else, and the word content used as a shield. She felt all of it, and she held it, and she chose not to set it down because it was hers, and it had made her who she was, but she chose also not to carry it into whatever came next, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had told her that the worst thing a woman could do was make herself so small she disappeared. She was not small. She was not invisible. She had never, it turned out, been either of those things. She had simply been waiting for herself as much as for him to remember it. She took his hand, and Nathaniel Ashford, who had taken 3 years and 2 months and 11 days to understand the value of what he had led his wife into their own great hall, and they danced, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. He danced like a man who intended to keep dancing. She danced like a woman who intended to let him. The room moved around them, and the fiddles played, and the candles threw their particular warmth across everything, and Virginia's finest watched the Ashfords in the middle of the floor, and understood, as people always understood when they were paying attention, that something had changed. That the woman who had spent years at every gathering standing alone near the east windows had found or reclaimed or simply finally been given something she had always deserved. The music played on. Elizabeth Ashford did not look toward any window. She was exactly where she meant to be in the life she had chosen and rebuilt and refused to disappear from, with her hand in her husband's hand and her eyes open and her spine straight. Her mother's daughter, her own woman seen at last by the person who should have seen her first. And that after everything was enough. More than enough. It was everything.